The moment David Cooper stepped through the double doors of Hargrove's General Store, the entire room went silent. Every face turned toward him. Every whispered conversation died on every pair of lips. And there they stood, the three women who had made Ella Finley's life an unrelenting misery since the day she arrived in Dusty Creek. Nevada, Margaret Holloway, her daughter Patricia, and the postmaster's wife, Cecilia Greer, all of them huddled around the Cracker Barrel with their heads bent together like vultures picking at something already broken. David's jaw was tight. His hands were steady at his sides, which was somehow more frightening than if he had reached for the revolver holstered at his hip. He was not a man given to anger. Everyone in Dusty Creek knew that. They called him the Gentle Rancher, and they meant it with admiration, because David Cooper was the kind of man who would carry a wounded calf on his shoulders through a blizzard and never once complain, the kind of man who tipped his hat to strangers and meant it. But his eyes right now were not gentle. They were the color of a storm rolling in off the Sierra Nevada, and those three women felt the temperature in the room drop by 10 degrees. "David," Margaret Holloway began, smoothing the front of her dress with her thick, ringed fingers. "I know exactly what you were just doing," he said. His voice was low and even, and somehow that made it worse. A man who yells is a man who can be talked down. A man who speaks quietly with that particular stillness in his voice is a man who has already made his decision. "I've been hearing things, Margaret. Things that have been coming out of this store and spreading across this town like poison in a water well." Patricia Holloway lifted her chin. She was 26 years old and wore her contempt for people she considered beneath her like a second dress. "We have only ever spoken the truth about that woman." David looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Everything you have said about her is a lie, every single word of it, and you will answer for it." The silence in Hargrove's General Store was so complete that the tick of the clock on the back wall sounded like a hammer on an anvil. And then, because the story of how David Cooper came to stand in that room with that look on his face did not begin in that store. It began 4 months earlier on a Thursday morning when a train pulled into the Dusty Creek station, and a woman stepped off it clutching a brown leather bag and looking at the Nevada desert like she was deciding whether it was an ending or a beginning. Her name was Ella Finley, and she was 24 years old, and she had come from Charlottesville, Virginia, with exactly $11, a change of clothes, a silver locket that had belonged to her mother, and a determination so fierce it had scared her the entire 3-week journey west. She had not come as a mail-order bride, though the town would later decide that she had, because that was a story simpler and therefore more satisfying to the gossips of Dusty Creek than the truth. The truth was considerably more complicated and considerably more painful, and it was Ella's own story to tell or not tell as she chose. The truth was that Ella Finley had been a schoolteacher in Charlottesville for 2 years, and she had been dismissed from her position 6 months before the train arrived in Nevada. And the reason she had been dismissed was because she had refused to change a grade on a test paper for the son of the man who sat on the school board, a man named Gerald Pendleton, who had never heard the word no from a woman and did not respond well to hearing it for the first time. Ella had appealed to the school board. The school board sided with Gerald Pendleton. Ella had no money to hire a lawyer and no family left in Virginia to take her in. Her mother had died of fever when Ella was 19. Her father had died of a broken heart, or so she had always believed 2 years after that. She had a distant aunt in Sacramento, California, who had once written her a letter that was warm enough to offer a possible lifeline. She had taken the lifeline. She had gotten as far as Dusty Creek, Nevada, because that was where her money ran out. She stood on the platform with her brown leather bag and she looked at the town, and the town looked back at her. And she squared her shoulders and walked toward the nearest building with an open door, which happened to be the Dusty Creek Hotel and Boarding House, operated by a sun-weathered woman named Agnes Tucker, who charged 40 cents a night and asked no questions. Ella had enough for 2 nights. She spent the first night calculating what to do, and the second night walking to the schoolhouse she had spotted at the edge of town and peering through the window at the rows of empty desks, because there was no teacher in Dusty Creek either, and the children of the ranchers and miners and merchants who lived there had been without formal schooling for 3 months. She had spoken to Agnes Tucker about it over a breakfast of cornbread and salt pork, and Agnes Tucker had said yes, she knew, it was a terrible shame, and the town council had been trying to find someone, but nobody wanted to come all the way out here to the edge of nothing. "I would take the position," Ella said simply. Agnes Tucker had looked at her the way people look at someone they have not yet decided whether to trust. Then she said, "You are a teacher." "I am," Ella said. Agnes Tucker had taken her to see Mayor Hiram Dodd that very morning, and Hiram Dodd, who was a practical man interested primarily in practical solutions, had asked Ella 3 questions, looked at her references, and offered her the position of schoolteacher at a wage of $18 a month plus a room in the back of the schoolhouse that she could use as living quarters. Ella Finley had accepted before he finished the sentence. That was how she came to Dusty Creek. Not as a bride, not as a woman running from anything dark or criminal, not as a fallen woman, not as a thief, not as any of the things that Margaret Holloway and Cecilia Greer would later tell each other and anyone else who would listen. She came as a woman who needed work and was willing to do it honestly. She came as a teacher. She met David Cooper on her 4th day in Dusty Creek, and it was entirely by accident. She had been on her way back from the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse, carrying a bucket of water for the room she was cleaning out and making habitable, and she did not see the horse coming around the corner of the livery stable until she was already in its path. The horse did not trample her because the man on its back reacted with a reflex born of 15 years of managing animals in unpredictable situations, and he pulled the horse up short with a firm hand and an easy word that settled the animal instantly. Ella stumbled back and dropped the bucket, and the water went across the dirt in a dark spreading stain. "Ma'am," the man said, dismounting in a single fluid motion that spoke of someone who had done it 10,000 times, "I am deeply sorry. I should not have come around that corner at that pace." She looked up at him. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled a little at the edges under his hat, and eyes that were a remarkable shade of gray-green that she would later think about more than she intended to. He was perhaps 28 or 29, and he wore the clothing of a working rancher, practical and clean. "It was my fault," she said. "I wasn't looking." "Neither was I, and I was the one on the horse, which means the responsibility is mine." He picked up her bucket. He dusted it off with his hand. He looked at the spilled water and then at the creek behind her. "Can I refill this for you?" She blinked. Men in her experience either apologized or justified. They rarely offered to fix the thing they had broken. "Thank you," she said, "but I can manage." He handed her the bucket and touched the brim of his hat. "David Cooper," he said. "I run the Cooper Ranch about 3 miles north. If you are the new schoolteacher, my neighbor's children will be in your classroom on Monday." "Ella Finley," she said. "And yes, I am." He smiled, and it rearranged his whole face into something warm and unguarded. "Then Dusty Creek is very lucky," he said, and he meant it simply and without performance, and that was the thing that lodged itself somewhere under her sternum and stayed there long after he remounted his horse and rode away. She told herself it meant nothing. She was here to work, not to develop complicated feelings about ranchers with remarkable eyes. She told herself this several times over the following weeks, which was how she knew it was not entirely working. The school opened on a Monday in late August of 1882, and Ella had 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, and she threw herself into the work with the kind of focused energy that comes from having no other outlet for one's entire capacity for caring. She was a good teacher, possibly an exceptional one. She had a gift for finding the specific key that unlocked each particular child's understanding, and she used it without hesitation. The children loved her. This was not a difficult thing to see. Their parents were more measured, which Ella expected. She was a stranger, and the West was full of strangers who turned out to be something other than what they claimed. She understood the caution. She earned trust quietly and consistently, through showing up every day and doing her job with care. And gradually, the mothers who dropped off their children in the morning began to linger a moment to speak with her, and the fathers who picked them up in the evening began to nod in that acknowledging way that meant they had decided she was all right. David Cooper's neighbors, the Marsh family, had 2 children in her class, and it was through them that David began to hear regular reports of the new school teacher. 8-year-old Thomas Marsh apparently talked about Miss Finley the way other children talked about Saturday. His mother, Helen Marsh, told David this one afternoon when he stopped by to help Clyde Marsh repair a section of fence that had come down in a storm, and she said it with a knowing look that David decided to ignore. He saw Ella Finley at church on Sundays and tipped his hat, and she nodded back, and he thought that was probably the appropriate boundary for a man who had no particular right to want more. He had his ranch. He had his cattle. He had his work, which was considerable and demanding, and usually enough to fill a day without room left over for longing. Usually. It was Margaret Holloway who first noticed that David Cooper looked at the new school teacher a moment longer than strictly necessary, and Margaret Holloway who began to watch Ella Finley with the particular attention of a woman cataloging evidence. Margaret Holloway was 52 years old and had lived in Dusty Creek for 20 years, and she had a position in the social architecture of the town that she had built carefully over those 2 decades. She was the wife of the wealthiest merchant in town. She sat on the Ladies' Aid Society committee. She knew everyone's business, and she had a daughter she was determined to marry well. Patricia Holloway had been hoping to marry David Cooper for 2 years. This was not a secret. David Cooper was the most eligible man in Dusty Creek and the surrounding area. He was 30 years old. He owned outright a profitable cattle ranch of 3,000 acres. He was handsome in the reliable, steady way of men built for hard work, and he was kind, which was rarer than people liked to admit. David Cooper had never expressed any romantic interest in Patricia Holloway. He was polite to her, as he was polite to everyone, but there was nothing in his manner that suggested anything beyond politeness. Margaret Holloway had always believed this was simply a matter of time and opportunity. Patricia was a beautiful girl from a good family. Of course, David would eventually see what was in front of him. And then Ella Finley had arrived in Dusty Creek, and David Cooper had begun looking at her with those gray-green eyes in that particular way, and Margaret Holloway had felt something calcify in her chest into something very like hatred. The rumors began quietly. This was how these things always begin. It started with Cecilia Greer mentioning, quite casually, to 2 women at the Saturday market that she had heard the new school teacher had not come from Virginia at all, but from somewhere rather less respectable. This was entirely invented. Cecilia Greer had heard no such thing. But Cecilia Greer was a woman who filled in the gaps of what she did not know with what she imagined, and she had been told by Margaret Holloway, in the coded language of women who have operated together in the same social sphere for years, that the new schoolteacher bore watching. The rumor shifted and grew in the way rumors do, accreting new details with each new telling. By the end of September, there was a story circulating in Dusty Creek that Ella Finley had been dismissed from a teaching position in Virginia for reasons that were never quite specified but were implied to be shameful. Then the story grew to include a man, because there is always a man in stories designed to damage a woman's reputation. By October, multiple people in Dusty Creek had heard a version of the story that included a scandalous relationship, a dismissal, and a flight west to escape the consequences. None of it was true. None of it bore any relationship to the actual circumstances of Ella Finley's departure from Virginia, which had been a straightforward injustice of the sort visited upon women who refused to be convenient to powerful men. But Ella did not know the rumor existed, at first. She was inside the schoolhouse with her students, doing her work. David Cooper heard it for the first time on a Tuesday in mid-October from a ranch hand named Garrett who had heard it at the saloon. David had been checking the condition of one of the barn doors, which needed new hinges, and Garrett had come back from town with the supplies and delivered the gossip the way men often deliver gossip, not with malice, but with the assumption that the listener will find it as entertainingly scandalous as the speaker did. David set down the hinge he was holding and looked at Garrett. "Where did you hear that?" he said. Garrett, who had a good enough instinct to recognize when something had landed wrong, said he had heard it at Denton's saloon from a man who had heard it from Cecilia Greer. David did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "I do not want to hear that kind of talk at this ranch, Garrett. Not about Miss Finley or about anyone else." Garrett said, "Yes, sir," and went back to his work. But David could not go back to his as easily, because something was sitting in his chest that he did not have a precise word for. He had spoken to Ella Finley perhaps 6 times in the past weeks, always briefly, always in public, always with the appropriate social distance of a man who was not sure of his welcome. But in those brief conversations, he had gathered an impression of her that was so entirely unlike the story Garrett had just told him that the two things could not exist in the same reality. She was precise in her thinking. She was direct in a way that was somehow also warm. She laughed at things that were actually funny rather than at things people expected her to laugh at. She had told him once, standing outside the church while the congregation dispersed around them, that she thought the greatest luxury she could imagine was a library large enough to get genuinely lost in, and she had said it with such matter-of-fact longing that it had stayed with him for days. He did not believe the story. He did not believe a single word of it. But disbelieving a story and being able to stop it are two different problems, and David Cooper spent the next several weeks trying to figure out what exactly he could do. He started, quietly, by asking questions. He spoke to Mayor Hiram Dodd, who had hired Ella, and asked whether Dodd had checked her references. Dodd said yes. He had written to the school in Charlottesville and received a letter back confirming that Ella Finley had taught there for 2 years and had been an excellent teacher, and that she had left the position under circumstances that the letter described carefully and diplomatically as a disagreement with the school board over a matter of academic integrity. Academic integrity. David turned those words over in his mind. He also, that same week, had occasion to see what Ella Finley was actually made of, in a moment that had nothing to do with gossip and everything to do with character. There was a boy in her class named Samuel Briggs, 12 years old, son of a miner who drank too much and a mother who was doing her best with too few resources. Samuel had been missing school with increasing frequency, and on the Wednesday that David happened to be riding past the schoolhouse at the end of the school day, he saw Ella walk all the way to the Briggs house on the south edge of town and knock on the door and speak for 15 minutes to Samuel's mother, and when she left, she was carrying a basket that she had arrived without, which meant she had brought something for that family and left it without making a show of it. He had not meant to watch. He had simply been there, on the road, on his way back from town, and the scene had arranged itself in front of him. He rode past without disturbing either of them, but the thing sitting in his chest got considerably heavier. He found an occasion to speak to her properly for the first time at the harvest social that Agnes Tucker organized every year in the last week of October, held in the cleared-out floor of Hargrove's livery, with lanterns strung along the rafters and a fiddler from 2 towns over and every family in Dusty Creek and the surrounding ranches in attendance. Ella Finley came alone, which David had expected. She wore a dark blue dress that was well made and simply cut, and she stood near the food table talking to Helen Marsh with the ease of a woman who was comfortable in social situations but not performing. When Helen Marsh's youngest demanded her mother's attention, Ella turned to look around the room with the expression of a person who is content to observe. David crossed the room with a directness he would later attribute to having run out of patience with himself. "Miss Finley," he said. She looked up at him and something in her face shifted almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "Mr. Cooper, would you like to dance?" he said. "They are about to play a reel." She considered him for a moment in that way she had of actually thinking about things before she answered, which he found startlingly attractive in a world full of people who spoke before thinking. "Yes," she said, "I would." They danced the reel and then another dance after it, and by the time the fiddler took a break, David Cooper knew that the thing in his chest was not going to resolve quietly or conveniently. She made him laugh. She challenged two things he said with a precision that made the challenge feel like a gift rather than an attack. When she talked about her students, her whole face changed, became illuminated, became entirely itself. Margaret Holloway watched from across the livery floor with her jaw set and her eyes calculating. Patricia Holloway watched with her hands clasped so tightly together the knuckles went white. Cecilia Greer watched and then leaned toward the woman next to her and began to whisper, and whatever she whispered traveled the room in the invisible way these things travel. And by the end of the evening there was a new addition to the existing rumor, that Ella Finley had set her cap at David Cooper quite deliberately and shamelessly, that she was after his ranch and his money, and had identified him as her target from the moment she stepped off the train. Ella knew none of this yet. She walked home through the cool October night with a warmth in her chest that she was trying very hard to be sensible about, and she sat in her small room at the back of the schoolhouse and looked at the ceiling and told herself firmly that she was here to work and to earn enough money to eventually reach her aunt in Sacramento, and that developing feelings for a rancher she had known for less than 2 months was the least sensible thing she could possibly do. She told herself this several times. She was starting to notice she said that a lot. November arrived with a cold wind off the mountains and a frost that turned the desert landscape brittle and silver in the mornings. Ella's classroom was heated by a cast iron stove that needed constant tending, and she learned to arrive an hour early to have the room warm before the children came in. She was good at learning the practical requirements of a life. She had been learning them since she was 19. It was in early November that she began to notice something was wrong. It started small. A mother who had previously lingered in the morning to speak with her now dropped her children and left without meeting Ella's eyes. A merchant's wife who had always been friendly at church turned her face away when Ella passed on the street. Little things, things that could be interpreted multiple ways. Things that a person trying to be fair to the world might explain away. Then 11-year-old Ruth Dodd, the mayor's daughter, said something that could not be explained away. She said it without knowing what she was saying, the way children say important things, casually and without preamble in the middle of a lesson about fractions. She said, "My mother says Miss Finley came here because she had to leave Virginia on account of something bad she did." The room went very quiet in the particular way a classroom goes quiet when someone has said something they understand instinctively to be significant without knowing why. Ella breathed in and breathed out. She made her voice even. "Let's focus on the fractions, Ruth," she said. "We have a lot to get through today." She got through the rest of the day. She got through it because she was professional and because she loved her students and because she had been getting through days considerably worse than this one since she was 19 years old. But that evening, alone in her small room, with the stove popping and the wind rattling the schoolhouse windows, she sat at her desk and felt the full weight of what she was beginning to understand. Someone was telling lies about her, not vague, general lies. Specific lies, or at least specific implications, circulating with enough authority that they had reached the mayor's household, and from there the mayor's 11-year-old daughter, and from there the classroom. She spent a long time that evening trying to decide what to do. She could go to Mayor Dodd. She could try to find out where the rumors were coming from and confront the source. She could simply continue to do her work and trust that over time the truth would be evident. She decided to start by trying to find out more. She went the next morning to Agnes Tucker, who had been the first person to help her in Dusty Creek, and whom she trusted as much as she trusted anyone there. Agnes Tucker listened to what Ella told her. Then Agnes Tucker was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee cup, and then she said, carefully, that yes, she had been hearing some things, and she had not known whether to say something or not, and she was sorry she had not said something sooner. She told Ella what she had heard. She was thorough about it, and she was kind about it, and by the time she finished, Ella felt as though someone had pressed a cold hand flat against her chest. The story in circulation was not just a vague implication. It was detailed. It involved a man, a dismissal, a secret engagement broken under shameful circumstances. It was built on nothing and dressed in specificity, which made it more damaging than a story that was obviously fabricated, because specificity gives lies the texture of memory. "Who started it?" Ella asked. Her voice was steady. She was very good at steady. Agnes Tucker said she believed it started with Cecilia Greer, who was a close friend of Margaret Holloway, and that Margaret Holloway was the one who had been feeding Cecilia Greer details as they went. Ella nodded. She thanked Agnes. She walked back to the schoolhouse in the cold morning air and stood outside it for a long moment, looking at the mountains. She understood now why certain parents had pulled back. She understood the averted eyes and the changed greetings. And she understood, with a clarity that was also a kind of grief, that in a small town in 1882, a woman alone with no family connections and no long-standing relationships had very little protection against a story told by a woman with 20 years of social capital and a clear motive. What motive? She turned that question over. It took her less time than she expected to arrive at the answer, because she was an observant woman and she had noticed, at the Harvest Social, the way Margaret Holloway and Patricia Holloway had watched her dance with David Cooper. And then the grief she felt shifted into something else. Something harder and cleaner. Not anger exactly. Something more like resolve. She would not leave. She would not be run out of the position she had earned honestly and was doing well. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her pack her brown leather bag and get back on a train. But she also needed to be realistic about what she could do on her own, and what she could do on her own was considerably limited by the same structures that had dismissed her from Virginia in the first place. Women who challenged the narrative of powerful women in a small community often found themselves more isolated, not less. It was David Cooper who came to see her. He arrived at the schoolhouse on a Saturday morning when the children were not there, knocked at the door, and when she opened it, he took his hat off and held it in both hands and said, directly and without preamble, "I have been hearing things being said about you in this town that are not true, and I want you to know that I know they are not true." She looked at him for a moment. "Come in," she said. He sat in the chair she used when she was not teaching, which she offered because it was the only adult-sized chair in the room that wasn't her own desk chair. She sat at her desk, and they looked at each other across the small space of the classroom. "How do you know they are not true?" She said, "Because I have been paying attention," he said. "I have been watching how you work and how you treat people, and I spoke to Mayor Dodd about his conversation with your references in Virginia, and I heard what he said about academic integrity. I can put those things together." He paused. "Also, the story they are telling does not sound like you, at all." Something happened in the region of her throat that she controlled carefully. "You have known me for less than 2 months," she said. "I know," he said. "But sometimes 2 months is enough." She looked at the desk for a moment, then she told him the truth. She told him about Gerald Pendleton and the test paper and the school board and the $11 and the aunt in Sacramento and the train that had stopped in Dusty Creek. She told him all of it in a matter-of-fact voice, because it was the truth and she was not ashamed of it, and she was tired of carrying it alone. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not make the face some people make when they are calculating whether they believe you. He simply listened, and when she finished he said, "I am sorry that happened to you, and I am sorry it has followed you here in this new form." She felt the back of her eyes go warm and she pressed it back firmly. She had cried about Gerald Pendleton exactly once, The night after the school board meeting, and she had not cried since, and she was not going to start now. "What I want to know," she said, "is what can be done, practically." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and she noticed that he thought the same way she did, practically and directly, without a lot of decorative sentiment around the thinking. "Margaret Holloway is the source," he said. "Cecilia Greer is the conduit. I think the clearest thing would be to address it directly." "I have no standing to address Margaret Holloway directly," Ella said. "She has 20 years in this community and I have 2 months. If I confront her, I become the hysterical newcomer making accusations against a respectable woman." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a true thing," he said. "I, however, have standing to address her directly." She looked at him carefully. "Why would you do that?" The question hung in the room. He met her eyes, and there it was, the thing that neither of them had said out loud, suddenly as visible as the mountains outside the window. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said. "And because I find that I have developed a considerable investment in your welfare, Ella Finley, and I suspect you know that." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I am not in a position to be a project for someone's chivalry, Mr. Cooper." "David," he said, "and I am not offering chivalry. I am offering the truth, which is that I think you are one of the most remarkable people I have come across in 30 years of living, and the idea of these women damaging what you have built here with their lies is something I am not able to sit quietly with." The room was very still. Outside, the wind had dropped and the desert lay flat and silent in the November light. Ella said, "I need to think about this." "Of course," he said. He stood and put his hat back on. "I will not do anything without your knowledge and your approval. This is your fight and I will not take it away from you, but I want you to know I am on your side." He left, and she sat in the empty classroom for a long time after, looking at the rows of small desks and thinking about what it meant to have someone on your side and how unfamiliar it felt and how much, under all her careful practicality, she had wanted exactly that. She thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd day she went to find David Cooper at his ranch. She had never been to the Cooper ranch before, and she walked the 3 miles rather than trying to arrange a horse because she needed the time and the movement to organize her thoughts. And by the time she arrived at the gate, the cold air had put color in her cheeks, and her mind was settled. He saw her coming from the far field where he was working, and he walked to meet her, and there was something in the way he walked toward her, purposeful and direct and entirely without pretense, that cemented the thing she had already decided. "I have thought about it," she said, when they were close enough to speak without raising their voices. "And I agree. But I want to be there when you say it." He nodded. "Yes, that was my intention." They stood in the pale November sunlight at the gate of the Cooper ranch, and she thought that this was not the kind of story she had expected her life to become, and that possibly that was all right. "There is something else," David said. "I want to say it now because I think it is better to be clear, and I think you are a person who prefers clarity." She braced herself slightly, not from fear but from the old habit of women who have been disappointed by things they hoped for. He said, "I would like to court you properly if you are willing. I am not asking you to make any decisions today. I am telling you what I want, so that you know it and can factor it into your own thinking." She looked at him for a very long time. The wind moved through the dry grass of the Nevada desert, and somewhere one of his cattle made a sound and the whole landscape waited. "I will factor it into my thinking," she said, which was as close as she was willing to come right now to telling him that she had already factored it, and that the answer she had arrived at was yes. He understood. She could see that he understood. And he smiled, that warm, unguarded smile that rearranged his face into something that made her chest hurt, and he said, "That is good enough for me." They planned what they would do. The place where Margaret Holloway and her Confederates were most consistently together was Hargrove's General Store on Tuesday mornings, when the weekly supply delivery came in, and the women of the town gathered to look at the new goods and share, as generously as they shared goods, the week's accumulation of information. David knew this because everyone in Dusty Creek knew this. Margaret Holloway's Tuesday morning salon at Hargroves was as established an institution as the church service on Sunday. They chose the following Tuesday. Ella would not come with David to the store. This was her own decision, arrived at through clear thinking about what would be most effective. If she came with him, it would look like a confrontation between two women with a man arbitrating, and the story would be about the drama and the conflict. If David came alone, it would be a man speaking clearly and publicly about what he knew and what he expected, and the story would be about what he said. She trusted him to say it well. She was discovering that she trusted him in a general way that went considerably beyond the specifics of this particular situation, which was either wonderful or alarming, and she had decided to call it wonderful. On Monday night she sat in her room and wrote in her journal, which she had kept since she was 14. She wrote, "Tomorrow a man I have known for less than 3 months is going to walk into a room full of people and stand up for me in a way that no one has ever done before, and I find that I do not have words for what that means, which is unusual for me as I generally have words for things." She paused and then wrote, "I think I am in love with David Cooper, which is the least convenient thing I have ever thought and also possibly the truest." She closed the journal. On Tuesday morning, David Cooper rode into town, tied his horse in front of Hargrove's general store, took a moment to collect himself, and walked through those double doors. He saw them immediately. Margaret Holloway, Patricia Holloway, Cecilia Greer, and also May Whitfield, who was less a driver of the gossip than a passenger, but a passenger who had chosen to get on the vehicle. There were several other people in the store. Jim Hargrove behind the counter. 2 men by the door he half knew from the mining operation outside town. Old Henry Crane, who had been sitting in that corner with a coffee cup every Tuesday morning for as long as anyone could remember. The room went quiet. David walked to the center of the room. He looked at Margaret Holloway. He said the words he had composed carefully over the preceding days. He said them with the same quiet certainty he used for everything important, without performance, without theatrics, but with a weight behind them that came from knowing exactly what he meant and meaning it completely. "I know what has been said about Ella Finley in this town," he said. "I know who said it, and I know where it started, and I know what the reason for it was. I have verified the facts of her situation in Virginia, and the story being circulated has no relationship to those facts whatsoever. Everything you have said about her is a lie, every single word of it, and you will answer for it." Margaret Holloway's face went through several colors. "I don't know what you think you know," she began. "I know enough," he said. "I know that you started this, Margaret, because you did not want Ella Finley to have the position she had earned, and because you were afraid of something that was never yours to begin with. I know that Cecilia has been your instrument in this. And I know that the two of you, together and separately, have been deliberately constructing and spreading a fabricated story, designed to damage the reputation of a woman who has done nothing to any of you." Jim Hargrove, behind the counter, set down the thing he was holding and said nothing, because he was a man who understood when something important was happening and knew enough to let it happen. Old Henry Crane in the corner looked interested in the way old men look interested when they have seen a great deal and recognize that this is a moment worth noting. Cecilia Greer had gone very pale. "It was only talk," she said. "People talk." "People talk," David agreed. "And people answer for the harm their talk does. Ella Finley is the best teacher this town has had, possibly the best it will have. She came here honestly and has done her work with more dedication than this town deserves, given how it has treated her. And she has done it while being slandered by women who should know better." He paused. "I am going to tell you what is going to happen now. You are going to stop. And you are going to consider very carefully how you repair the damage you have already done, because I assure you, Margaret, that your husband will be hearing from me about this, and Mayor Dodd will be hearing from me about this, and I suspect that the reputation you have been so careful to protect will not survive an honest accounting of what you have been doing and why." Margaret Holloway's jaw was very tight. "You have no right to speak to me this way, David Cooper. And you had no right to do what you did to Ella Finley," he said simply. "So here we are." He looked around the room once, making sure his meaning was clear to everyone present because he wanted witnesses, because he understood that words spoken in public carry more weight than words spoken in private. Then he walked out of Hargrove's general store. He untied his horse from the post. He mounted. He sat for a moment in the pale Tuesday morning sun. Then he rode to the schoolhouse. Ella was at the door before he reached it, because she had been watching the road since 8 in the morning. She stepped outside and pulled her shawl around her against the cold, and she looked up at him on the horse with those clear brown eyes that he had been thinking about since August. "It is done," he said. She nodded. "What happened?" he told her. He was thorough about it, the same way she had been thorough when she told him the truth about Virginia. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Will it hold?" she asked. "Will it be enough to stop it?" "I believe it will," he said. "Margaret Holloway's primary concern is her reputation in this town, and I have made clear that her reputation is now contingent on her behavior. I also mean what I said about speaking to Henry Holloway and to Dodd." He paused. "I will not claim it will undo all the damage. People remember what they heard. But a story corrected publicly in front of witnesses with the correction coming from someone the community trusts carries weight." She nodded again. She was thinking. He watched her think and found it one of the most compelling things he had ever watched. Then she said, "Thank you, David." He looked at her from the horse for a moment. Then he dismounted, because this did not feel like a conversation to have with the advantage of height. He stood in front of her in the cold November morning and he said, "I need you to know that I did not do that only for the practical purpose of protecting your position, though that matters. I did it because what they said about you was wrong, and the wrongness of it was not something I could carry and stay silent." She looked at him. "I know," she said quietly. He said, "I meant what I said on Saturday about courting you, about what I want." The wind moved her hair. She reached up and tucked it back and said, "I know that too." "Then," he said, "will you have dinner with me on Friday? At the hotel properly where people can see, because I am tired of being careful about distances and I think you deserve to be treated with the respect of a direct intention." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he felt the weight of the weight in his chest. Then she said, "Yes, David, I will have dinner with you on Friday." He smiled. She smiled back. And for a moment they stood in the desert morning with the cold air around them and something new and warm between them that neither of them tried to name yet, because some things get ruined by being named too quickly, and both of them were wise enough to know that. He rode back to his ranch. She went back to her classroom. The following days were not simple. Simple would have been too easy, and the truth was that Margaret Holloway did not recede quietly. She had too much invested in the architecture she had built to dismantle it overnight on the word of a rancher, even a rancher of David Cooper's standing. What she did do was retreat into a furious and extremely visible silence, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. She stopped speaking about Ella Finley publicly. Cecilia Greer, who was fundamentally not a malicious woman but rather a weak one, and who had been thoroughly frightened by David's words, went to Ella herself 3 days later and stood outside the schoolhouse door at the end of the day looking so miserable that Ella almost felt sorry for her. Cecilia said, "I am sorry. I know that is not enough, but I am sorry." Ella considered the woman standing in front of her. She thought about what it cost to be wrong and know it and say so, because it was not a small thing, regardless of what you had done to necessitate it. "Don't repeat things you don't know to be true," Ella said. "That's all I ask." Cecilia nodded and walked away, and Ella stood in the doorway watching her go, and felt something release in her chest that she had been holding tightly for weeks. The dinner on Friday was perfect. Not in the way of an expensive, formal thing, because Dusty Creek's hotel dining room was serviceable rather than elegant, with plain wooden tables and oil lamps and food that was good but simple. It was perfect because David Cooper had made a reservation and arrived exactly on time and held her chair for her not as a performance, but as a reflex of courtesy. And then they had talked for 2.5 hours about things that actually mattered to them, books and the nature of justice, and what it meant to build a life in a place that was itself still being built. And every so often one of them would say something that made the other laugh. And every so often they would say something that made the other go quiet and thoughtful, and both of those things felt exactly right. He walked her home after. The cold night air smelled of wood smoke and distance, and the particular clarity that the Nevada desert has in winter. At the door of the schoolhouse he stopped and turned to her and said, "I think you are the most interesting person I have ever met." "You should get out more," she said, which made him laugh. Then he said, "May I?" and gestured very slightly toward her, and she understood what he was asking and she said yes. And he kissed her once, carefully and warmly, a kiss that was a beginning rather than a conclusion. And then he stepped back and looked at her with those gray-green eyes and said good night, and she went inside and stood against the closed door in the dark and felt the warmth of it spreading outward from her chest to the tips of her fingers. December came and the romance deepened in the quiet, steady way that things deepen when they are built on honesty rather than performance. He came to see her regularly now, openly, because the thing he had said in Hargrove's general store had made the nature of his feelings visible to the whole town, and there was no longer any useful pretense. He rode out to the schoolhouse in the evening sometimes, and they would sit at the 2 adult-sized chairs near the stove and talk, until it was not quite appropriate for him to stay any longer. And then he would ride home under the winter stars, and she would sit up reading by lamplight and feel the specific happiness of a person who has something to look forward to. He brought her books when he went to the town over the ridge that had a small bookshop. He brought her practical things too, because he was a practical man and he noticed practical needs, a better lamp wick, a set of mittens for the walk to the creek in the mornings, a small tin of something that turned out to be good coffee rather than the indifferent variety she had been managing with. He never made a production of these things. He simply left them or handed them over as though they were obvious, which made them mean more rather than less. She visited his ranch on a Sunday in mid-December and saw the scale of what he had built. 3,000 acres of Nevada desert turned productive by 15 years of consistent, intelligent work. Clean barns, well-maintained fences. A main house that was substantial and solid, and furnished with the unsentimental practicality of a man who had lived alone for a long time, which meant good bones and very few decorations. He showed her around with the pride of a man who has worked hard and is not ashamed to show it. And she asked good questions, and he answered them with the pleasure of someone whose work was finally being seen clearly. He introduced her to his foreman, an older man named Augustus Webb who had been with the ranch for 12 years and greeted Ella with a handshake and a look that assessed her quickly and seemed to arrive at a positive conclusion. Ella liked Augustus Webb. She liked the ranch. She liked the sweep of the land and the particular quality of the silence out there, 3 miles from the noise of the town, with only the wind and the cattle and the enormous Nevada sky. She liked, very much, the man who had built all of it. She told him that on the ride back to the schoolhouse in the wagon he had hitched for the occasion. She told him she liked his ranch very much. He said, "I am glad. I would like you to think of it as a place you are welcome." She understood the careful weight of that sentence, the way it pointed towards something without demanding an answer yet. "I do," she said. He looked at the road ahead and smiled. Christmas came and was warm with community in the way that small frontier towns are sometimes warm, where everyone's life is close enough to everyone else's, that the celebrations have a genuine texture that cities lose. The church was decorated, and the children's school Christmas program that Ella organized and directed was attended by every family in the community, and was, by general consensus, the best the town had seen, partly because the children had learned more and learned it better than they had under previous instruction, and partly because Ella had a gift for finding the thing each child could do well and putting them in a position to do it in front of their parents. Samuel Briggs, the miner's son who had been missing school, was given the role of narrator because Ella had discovered he could read with a fluency and expressiveness that was extraordinary for his age, and he stood at the front of the decorated schoolhouse and read his parts with a composure that made his mother in the back row press her handkerchief to her face. David sat in the audience with the Marsh family and watched Ella manage a production involving 14 children with the ease of someone who is doing exactly what they were made to do. He thought about the fact that she had arrived in Dusty Creek in August with $11 and a brown leather bag and had built all of this in 4 months, and he thought about what that said about who she was. He had made a decision. He had made it, truthfully, some weeks earlier, but he had been composing himself and composing his words with the care that such a thing deserved, because it was not a small thing, and he did not want to rush it, and he did not want it to feel like something he had not thought about completely. He went to Mayor Hiram Dodd the week after Christmas, not because Dodd had any formal authority over what David intended, but because Dodd was the closest thing to a civic elder in Dusty Creek, and it was the kind of gesture that meant something to David personally, to do things properly. Dodd listened. Dodd said that, in his opinion, David Cooper and Ella Finley were about the best match he could imagine, and that he had better not wait too much longer or someone was going to come along and make the same observation. David thanked him and rode home and spent 3 days being as certain as a person can be about a thing. And then on the 4th day he went to the schoolhouse on a Saturday morning in the first week of January of 1883, which was cold and clear and entirely still, with a thin layer of frost on the desert floor that caught the morning light. He knocked. She opened the door. She was wearing the dark blue dress and her hair was down, which was unusual, which meant she had not been expecting company, which meant he was seeing her entirely as herself without any preparation, which felt like a gift. She looked at him. "David, you should have sent word I would have." "I did not want you to prepare," he said. "I wanted it to be like this." He paused. "May I come in?" She stepped back from the door. He came in and took his hat off and held it in both hands, which was what he had done the first time he came to see her in this room, and she noticed that and felt her heart press upward against her ribs. "I have something to say," he said. "And I want to say it clearly and directly because I think you deserve clarity and directness, and because I think you have been through enough experiences of people being unclear and indirect with you." She said nothing. She watched him. He said, "I love you, Ella. I have been working my way toward saying that for some time, and I am saying it now because I think we are both past the point of pretending I don't." He paused. "And I want to ask you to marry me if you will have me, not because you need a practical solution. I know you do not. I know you are capable of building a life here on your own. I am asking you to marry me because you are the person I want to build with, and because every day I do not ask you feels like a day I am wasting, and because I think we would be very good together and I think we both know it." Ella Finley stood in the cold January morning in her small room at the back of the schoolhouse, with the stove ticking and the frost on the windows, and the man she loved standing in front of her with his hat in his hands and his gray-green eyes completely open. She had $11 when she stepped off the train. She had a silver locket and a change of clothes and a determination that had frightened her every day of the journey west, because she did not know where it was going to take her and she had been very alone for a long time. She said, "Yes, David, I will marry you." He crossed the room in 2 steps, and she was in his arms, and he held her with the careful intensity of someone who has been wanting to do this for a long time and is making the most of finally getting to. And she pressed her face against the warmth of his shoulder and felt the place inside her that had been braced and careful and self-sufficient for 5 years slowly, completely ease. They were married in February of 1883. It was a small wedding, but full. Agnes Tucker organized the flowers. Helen Marsh made the cake. Ella wore a dress that had been made for her by a seamstress 2 towns over. ivory-colored with a blue ribbon at the waist that matched the dress she had worn to the harvest social and to every other significant occasion of her acquaintance with David Cooper, because she had decided that color was lucky. Mayor Dodd officiated. The whole town came, or nearly the whole town, and this was itself a statement, because the whole town coming means the whole town is on your side, and the whole town was on Ella Finley's side now, or at least the part of the town that mattered. Margaret Holloway came, because not coming would have been the louder statement. She sat in the back with her jaw controlled and her expression fixed in something she was working to keep neutral. David noticed and said nothing. Ella noticed and decided, with the generosity that comes from having one, to simply let it go. They said their vows in the clear winter sunlight of the Dusty Creek Church, and when the minister pronounced them, Mary David kissed her in a way that made several people in the congregation applaud, which Ella had not expected and which made her laugh. And that laugh was the sound of someone who is genuinely happy, fully and without reservation, and everyone who heard it recognized it as such. They moved into the Cooper Ranch house together, and Ella discovered that what she had seen as its unfurnished quality was actually simply space waiting for someone to live in it alongside David, and she filled it with books and curtains she made herself from fabric she bought at Hargrove's and small deliberate choices about what mattered, and the house became something that was clearly, unmistakably, theirs. She continued teaching, because this was what she wanted, and David understood this completely. He had never suggested she should stop. He had understood from the beginning that her work was not incidental to who she was but central to it, and he would have no more asked her to give up teaching than he would have asked her to give up breathing. The arrangement required her to make the 3-mile ride to the schoolhouse in the mornings and back in the evenings, and David ensured she had a reliable horse for it, and in the worst winter, Weather drove her himself in the wagon without ever treating this as an imposition. The town continued to be what small towns are, a complicated mixture of goodness and limitation, community and judgment. But the balance had shifted. David's public statement in Hargrove's general store had settled something in the town's understanding of Ella, not just by challenging the lies that had been told, but by demonstrating, in the clearest possible terms, that she had someone willing to stand in a room full of people and stake his own reputation on her truth. That meant something. That meant more than arguments or evidence or any amount of patient disproof could mean on its own. It meant she was known and chosen and defended, and in a community that ran on exactly those social currencies, it changed everything. Margaret Holloway never apologized. Ella had not expected her to and did not require it. Margaret Holloway's daughter Patricia married a lawyer from Reno later that same year, which settled the question of her future in the way David had never been going to settle it, and Margaret Holloway left Dusty Creek before the following Christmas to go live with Patricia in Reno, and Dusty Creek exhaled quietly without her. Cecilia Greer became, over time and with considerable effort from both parties, something like a friend of Ella's. She was not a bad woman, Ella had always known. She was a weak one who had been used by a stronger one, and she had been honest about that and had tried, in the way of a person who is sincerely trying, to be better. Ella respected the effort, if not all the history behind it. The spring of 1883 was the most beautiful Ella had ever seen, though she acknowledged she was biased, as it was also the spring of her first months of married life at the Cooper Ranch, and she was in the kind of happiness that makes everything look more vivid. She and David fell into the rhythms of a shared life with a naturalness that she would later think about and marvel at, because she had not known it would feel this easy, this mutually self-evident. They were not the same person. They disagreed about things, sometimes sharply. David had a stubbornness about certain decisions that drove her to the edge of her patience, and she had a tendency to take on more than she could carry and refuse to ask for help that drove him to a similar edge. They had arguments that were real arguments, not performances, arguments that required apologies, and the following day quietness of two people who have seen something difficult in each other and chosen to stay. Every time, they chose to stay. In late September of 1883, 1 year after she had first looked at the harvest social lanterns and thought she was being sensible about a rancher, Ella told David she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen in the morning over coffee, because she was not a woman who arranged theatrical moments for announcements, and because the kitchen in the morning, with the light coming in through the new curtains and the smell of coffee and the ordinary solid presence of their life together, felt like exactly the right place. He went very still. Then he set down his coffee cup with enormous care and looked at her. "Ella," he said. "I know," she said. "March, I think." He was out of his chair and across the kitchen and had her in his arms before she could say anything else, and she felt the shaking in his arms that he was trying to control and loved him for the trying and for the not quite succeeding. "A child," he said into her hair. "A child," she confirmed. He pulled back to look at her face, and his eyes were very bright, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw and said, "Are you all right?" "I am the most all right I have ever been in my life," he said, which she decided to take as an answer. The pregnancy was not uncomplicated. Ella was healthy and strong and resilient, but the winter of 1883 into 1884 was a severe one, and there were weeks where the cold was such that David worried constantly, and she had to remind him firmly that she was not made of glass, and that excessive worry was not the same as care. She maintained her teaching position until February, when the ride became impractical, and she arranged for an older student, 15-year-old Clara Webb, Augustus Webb's granddaughter who had a gift for it, to manage the younger children under Ella's written instruction, which was a creative solution that Ella was rather proud of, and that Mayor Dodd approved with the comment that it was exactly the kind of thing he expected from her. The baby arrived on a windy March morning in 1884. He was a boy, 8 pounds and substantial, with dark hair that curled at the edges like his father's, and the steady examining look of someone who had decided to assess the situation before committing to an opinion. They named him James Robert Cooper, Robert for David's father who had died 4 years before, James because Ella had always loved the name, and because it suited him. David held his son for the first time with the same particular stillness he brought to everything important, and looked down at the small face and said nothing for a long time, and then looked at Ella where she lay exhausted and triumphant in their bed and said, "Thank you." "For what?" she said. "For everything," he said. "For coming here, for staying, for all of it." She closed her eyes. The morning light came through the curtains she had made, and the ranch was quiet except for the wind and the sound of Augustus Webb telling the hands outside to keep the noise down, because the mistress had just had the baby. She thought about $11 and a brown leather bag and a train platform in August, and a man on a horse who had pulled up short and apologized for the spilled water, and offered to fix what he had broken. She thought about how far she had come and how much she had built, and how none of it had been given to her, and how the one thing she had not known she was going to find, the thing she had not been looking for and had not allowed herself to want, had turned out to be the center of all of it. She went back to teaching in May, when James was 2 months old and the weather was warm, and she arranged her schedule with the practical creativity she brought to all problems. There was a woman who helped in the house, a Paiute woman named Sarah who had come from the nearby community, and who had a gentle and authoritative way with James that put Ella immediately at ease. The arrangement was a good one, fair in wages and hours in the way that Ella was determined it would be, because she had thought about fairness and what it meant, and how it was enacted in the everyday specifics of a life, and she intended to enact it carefully. The town of Dusty Creek grew. The railroad that had been a rumor for 2 years became a certainty in 1884, and with it came new families and new businesses and new children for Ella's classroom. She requested an assistant teacher in the fall of 1884 and received one, a young man named Thomas, fairly just out of a teacher's college in San Francisco, who was earnest and willing and learned quickly under her direction. The school became something Dusty Creek was genuinely proud of, which was not separate from Ella's work but was Ella's work, made visible in the way that good teaching becomes visible across time. Margaret Holloway's name came up occasionally, in the way that old storms get mentioned when the sky looks familiar. But it came up with less heat each time, and the lies she had told had been so thoroughly corrected, not just by David's public statement, but by the accumulated evidence of who Ella Finley actually was across years of living in the community, that they were more historical footnote than active wound. Ella thought about them sometimes. She thought about what it had meant to be in that position, without resources, without connections, without the social standing that protects a person, and to be vulnerable to the inventions of someone with a hidden motive and the social capital to make those inventions travel. She thought about the women who did not have a David Cooper to walk into Hargrove's general store and say the thing that needed to be said. She wrote about it sometimes in her journal. She thought it was important to be honest about the structures of it to understand them, because understanding them was the beginning of anything that might, in time, change them. In 1886, their second child was born. A girl this time, born in the summer, easy and joyful compared to the difficult winter of James's arrival. They named her Clara Mary Cooper, Clara after the Webb girl who had kept the school going when Ella could not ride, and Mary for David's mother. James, who was 2.5, approached his sister with the solemn intensity of a small person who has been told this is important and is going to take it seriously, looked at her for a long time, and then pronounced her very small in the tone of someone delivering a considered assessment. Ella and David looked at each other over James's head, and the look between them contained everything that does not need words. The Cooper Ranch prospered. The cattle market of the 1880s was demanding and occasionally brutal in its fluctuations, and there were years where the margins were thinner than David wanted, and years where a drought threatened the grazing that the cattle depended on, and years where the labor situation was complicated by the boom and bust rhythms of the Nevada economy. David managed all of it with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and Ella was beside him, in the sense of being fully aware of the ranch's situation and thinking about it alongside him, because she had not married a man to live at a remove from his reality. She was the one, in 1887, who suggested diversifying with a small grain crop, which seemed counterintuitive in Nevada, but which she had researched through correspondence with an agricultural society in Sacramento, and which turned out to be correct and profitable enough to smooth out the cattle revenue in the leaner years. David had listened to her proposal with his elbows on the kitchen table and his chin in his hand, looking at the letters she had spread out, and then looked up at her and said, "You know, I sometimes think you could run this ranch better than I can." "I think we run it well together," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "We do." In 1888, they received a letter from Ella's aunt in Sacramento. The aunt, whose name was Mildred Harris, had been trying to locate Ella for some years and had finally, through a somewhat tortuous chain of correspondence involving Agnes Tucker and the Sacramento Post Office, found her. The letter was warm and apologetic, and genuinely delighted to learn that Ella was well and married and teaching and had 2 children, and she very much hoped they might meet. Ella put the letter down and sat with it for a moment, feeling the complicated texture of the past, the $11 and the train and the cold platform, and the long years since she had had any family at all. Then she wrote back warmly and said she would very much like to visit. They made the trip to Sacramento in the summer of 1889, when James was 5 and Clara 3. It was the first time Ella had traveled any significant distance since the train west 7 years before, and she looked out of the train window at the Nevada desert unspooling past and thought about the woman who had sat in a similar seat going the other direction, frightened and determined and alone. She was not alone now. James was asleep against her shoulder, and Clara was asleep in David's lap, and the Nevada landscape was spectacular in the summer light, and her husband's hand was warm over hers on the seat between them. The visit with Aunt Mildred was everything she had hoped, and some things she had not. Mildred Harris was 70 years old and sharp-minded and delighted by the children, and she looked at David Cooper with the appraising look of a woman who has lived long enough to know a good man when she sees one and approves. And she took Ella aside on the second day and held her hands and said, "Your mother would have been so proud of you, Ella, so unspeakably proud." Ella did not cry in front of her aunt. She cried later quietly in the bedroom of the hotel where they were staying, with the Sacramento night sounds coming through the window, and David held her without asking too many questions because he understood that some griefs need to be honored and not solved, and she loved him for understanding that. They stayed a week. Mildred Harris came back to visit the Cooper Ranch the following spring, and she loved it, loved the scale of it and the Nevada sky and the grandchildren who climbed on her with the cheerful presumption of children who have never known anything but being loved. And she stayed for 6 weeks, and when she left she promised to come back. And she did, every year for as long as her health allowed. James Cooper started school at the Dusty Creek Schoolhouse at age 6, which required his mother to be scrupulously careful about not showing favoritism, and which James himself navigated with a philosophical approach to the strangeness of the situation that suggested he was going to be all right in life. Clara came 2 years later and was, from the first day, the most social person in any room, a quality that surprised her parents since neither of them was particularly given to it, and which turned out to be its own kind of gift. In 1891, Ella Finley Cooper turned 33 years old and celebrated it on the ranch with a dinner that included the Marsh family and Agnes Tucker and Augustus Webb and Thomas Fairley, who had been at the school for 7 years now and had become a friend rather than merely a colleague. David had arranged, quietly and over considerable effort, to have 2 books she had been trying to get for years shipped out from a bookshop in San Francisco, and he presented them over dinner with the expression of someone who is very pleased with himself, which he was entitled to be. She looked at the books and then at him, and then she crossed the dinner table with no concern for who was watching and kissed him on the cheek, which made James say "Mama" in the tone of a 7-year-old who finds parents embarrassing and Clara applaud. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, and the ranch was quiet under the vast Nevada sky, David and Ella sat on the porch of the house they had built together in the way that people who have been married 8 years sit, which is comfortably and without needing to fill the silence, and she looked out at the dark shape of the mountains and thought about all of it. About the gossips in a general store and the man who had walked in and said the thing she had needed someone to say. About the truth that had been there all along waiting to be defended. About the love that had grown from that moment of someone seeing her clearly and choosing to stand for what they saw. About the extraordinary complexity of arriving somewhere with almost nothing and building a life so full that it did not seem like it could possibly have fit into the same skin as the woman on the platform in August of 1882. "What are you thinking?" David said. "Many things," she said. "Anything you want to share." She turned to look at him. In the dim light from the window, his face was familiar in the way that only years of looking at something make it familiar, so familiar that you see it even when you are not looking at it, so familiar it has become part of the landscape of your own interior. "I am thinking," she said, "that you are the best decision I ever made." He reached over and took her hand. "You made quite a few good decisions," he said. "Stepping off that train, staying when it was hard, telling the truth when it would have been easier to hide it. You helped," she said. "We helped each other," he said. She thought about that and found it was exactly accurate. She had not been saved by David Cooper, because she had not needed saving in the fundamental sense. She had needed someone to stand beside her, and he had done that, and she had stood beside him through 15 years of weather and children and drought and prosperity and argument and repair, and all the ordinary extraordinary texture of a shared life, and neither of them was the person they had been before. They were better people for it. She believed that. She believed it the way she believed in the grain crop and the Nevada sky and James Cooper's laugh, which was exactly his father's laugh, and Clara Cooper's social grace, which seemed to have arrived from some earlier ancestral branch, and the library she was slowly building in the back room of the schoolhouse from donations and book sales, and the occasional shipping expense she bore herself. The town of Dusty Creek kept growing. By 1892, it had a newspaper, which was a sign of civic maturity, and the newspaper ran a piece on the schoolhouse and its teacher that was generous and accurate, the first piece of journalism about Ella Cooper that bore any relationship to who she actually was. She kept the clipping. She put it in the journal she had been keeping since she was 14, between the page where she had written about David's first declaration in the classroom and the page where she had written about James being born, and she thought that this was what a life looked like from the inside. Not a clean story with a clear arc, but a collection of pages, some of them blotched and some of them beautiful, held together by the spine of the person who lived them. In 1894, their third child arrived. A girl born in October, with Ella's brown eyes and David's dark curly hair, and a temper that announced itself immediately and remained for the rest of her childhood a remarkable feature of her personality. They named her Rose Agnes Cooper, Agnes for the woman who had given Ella a room and no questions and 40 cents a night and started everything. Agnes Tucker, who was by then 70 years old and had been told about the name in a letter delivered by David personally, sat in her chair behind the hotel counter and wept with a completeness that she would have denied if asked. James Cooper, at 10 years old, regarded his new sister with the complexity of a child who had already been the eldest for 10 years and understood what it meant. He told his father seriously that Rose seemed like she was going to be a lot of work. David said he was not wrong. James accepted this and went back to his arithmetic, which he was very good at, which was an inheritance from both parents. Clara, 8 years old, decided that Rose was her personal responsibility, and took this role so seriously for the next several years that Rose's first full sentence was telling Clara to leave her alone, which was reported at the dinner table and laughed over until David had to wipe his eyes. The ranch in 1895 was one of the largest operations in the county. David had expanded carefully over the years, adding acreage when the right opportunity came and the finances supported it, and he had a reputation among his neighbors and in the cattle business at large for being honest in his dealings and fair in his management of the men who worked for him, which was the kind of reputation that is worth more in the long run than any other kind. Augustus Webb had retired from the foreman position in 1892, and his place had been taken by his nephew, a capable man named Ellis Webb, and Augustus himself lived in a cottage on the property that David had built for him, because it had not occurred to David that there was any other appropriate arrangement for a man who had given 12 years to the ranch. Ella had agreed with this completely, and had furnished the cottage with the same care she furnished everything. By 1896, James was 12 and talking about working the ranch rather than going to the teacher's college in San Francisco that Ella was building a quiet campaign for. David listened to both of them argue their cases with the patience of a man who understood he was living with two people who were excellent at making arguments and who both happened to be right in their own ways. He told James, "The ranch will be here when you come back from school with the knowledge to run it better than either of us." He told Ella, "The boy has the land in him and it would be wrong to cut that out of him, but so does he have the mind, and we should not waste that either." They reached, as they generally reached, a position that honored both truths. The year 1897 was marked by a long, dry summer and a cattle market depression that cost several ranchers in the county their operations. But the Cooper Ranch came through it, partly because of the grain crop that had been Ella's idea a decade before, and partly because David had been conservative in his debt management and had cash reserves that got them through the leanest months. They lost some cattle. They did not lose the ranch. David said it was because Ella had thought further ahead than he would have on his own. She said it was because he had listened when she suggested it. They were both right. In the fall of 1897, Ella Finley Cooper turned 39 years old. She stood at the window of the ranch house in the early morning light, with the Nevada desert laid out before her in the colors it turns in the fall, tawny and silver, and the faint dusty rose of the distant mountains. And she thought about the 15 years since a train had stopped here and she had stepped off it. James was 13 and tall like his father, and already moving through the ranch with the authority of someone who knows where he belongs. Clara was 11 and had the whole of her future written in her bright particular way of being in the world, and it looked like a future that was going to be something. Rose was 3 and conducting herself with the permanent impression that the universe owed her an explanation, which Ella privately found hilarious. David came up behind her and put his arms around her from behind, and they stood at the window together in the morning light. She thought about Margaret Holloway and the lies that had been told in a general store on Tuesday mornings, and how a man had walked into that store and said the thing, and how saying the thing had been both the practical act it needed to be and also the declaration she had not known she was waiting to hear. Everything you said about her is a lie, and you will answer for it. She had answered for it herself in the end by simply continuing to be who she was, by teaching and caring and staying and building, by being present and honest in a community that could see her clearly now after years of proximity in a way that made the old lies look like the transparently desperate inventions they had always been. "I love this place," she said, looking at the desert. "I know," David said. "I love our life." "I know that too," he said. She leaned back against him and he held her, and the Nevada morning was still and vast and full of the light that only the West has, that particular extravagant light that seems like more than is strictly necessary and is, for that reason, exactly right. "Ella," he said. "Yes. I am very glad you stepped off that train," she smiled. She felt it move through her whole body, that smile, the way good things move through you when you have the sense to let them. "So am I," she said. "David, so am I." The sun came up over the mountains, and the Cooper ranch lay in the morning light, and the cattle moved in the far field. And inside the house, Rose Cooper woke up and began announcing her opinions about the day. And Clara went to manage her, and James came downstairs making noise, and the ordinary, beautiful, particular chaos of their life started up again like a piece of music that knows exactly how to begin. Ella Cooper turned from the window and went back into the middle of all of it, into the life she had built from $11 and a determination that had frightened her once, that did not frighten her anymore, that had become simply the engine of the thing she was, the woman who had come west with nothing and found, in the last place she expected, in the truth defended by a gentle rancher who loved her, everything.